Morena gamers. Thank you all for coming. I am Lisa, and I'm the Community Director and Narrative Designer at Runaway Play. We're based in Ōtepoti, Dunedin, and we make mobile games inspired by nature. And I have been the narrative designer for Old Friends Dog Game since its inception. And for this presentation, I'm mostly going to be talking about the development of the stories that we wrote. BB, which is before Bridget.
And I'm Bridget. Yeah, that's me. I'm a writer on Old Friends, and I do some occasional art and funny animations as well. Not these ones, but other ones. And I'll be talking a little bit later on in the talk about some of the just later development and technical aspects of the stories.
Cool, so this is pretty big talk, so we're just going to outline kind of what we're going to be going over today. First of all, how we research for the stories and the dogs, how we ended up kind of researching and coming to realize what the narrative would be, how this would be designed, how this became super overwhelming, and then how we used Yarn Spinner as our tool, how we then developed the pipeline for the stories, and how we connected the story and the game worlds together, as well as addressing some more things that were challenging, and then how we overcame them. So before we get into that though, how many people have seen or heard of the game or played it at all? Oh, amazing. Okay, great. For those of you that haven't, we'll just play the trailer. It's also coming out next week. Please download it. It's free. Okay, so Old Friends Dog Game is a game about friendship for people who love dogs. You can kind of see a little bit in the trailer there, but essentially you decorate your sanctuary, you can craft items like food and furniture, and most importantly, care for your dogs. By caring for your dogs through feeding, petting, and playing with them, you unlock stories with them that go deeper into their personalities, as well as their relationship with you, the player, as well as the surrounding community of neighbours. But these aren't just any old dogs. The thing that makes this game unique is because it's based on a real-life dog sanctuary in Tennessee, USA, and so all of the dogs in the game are real-life dogs. Has anyone heard of Old Friends Senior Dog Sanctuary before? Oh, yes. Great. So I've been a fan of theirs since like 2016. I was really into like these animal caretaking Facebook pages, and Old Friends also had a huge cult following on Tumblr where people would make fan art and memes for the dogs. And so around this time I shared it with like as many people as I could, including Emma, who's our creative director at Runaway and also a real life dog owner. So in 2017, Emma and I were on a plane to GDC, and we were just talking about how cool it would be to make a dog sanctuary game, and it kind of planted the seed for what Old Friends would then become. In 2018, Runaway also released Forester's Cat Cafe, which had been a really great success, and we were interested in making kind of more games around intimate relationships between humans and animals, and so we pitched the idea of Old Friends Dog Sanctuary to the rest of the Runaway team. We wanted it to be less like a dog collection simulator and more a game where you build an intimate bond with the dogs. So for this to work, it would have to be heavily story-based. Everyone in the team saw potential, and it was greenlit for prototyping. After that, we contacted the real-life Old Friends Senior Dog Sanctuary to see if they wanted to collaborate using them as inspiration for the game, and they were down to clown, and that's essentially how the game idea came to be. But how did the story tone, style, structure, and tools come together? So in the beginning, I quickly realized that the kind of game that we wanted to make didn't really exist on the mobile market at the time, which was pretty exciting but also really terrifying. We wanted to have like a mash of play styles and genres, since our core loop is centered around gameplay of kind of feeding the dog, playing with the dog, and petting the dog, and the more time that you spend with them is when you unlock stories with them. And so when you complete all of their stories, you become old friends forever. And the stories are a core part of the gameplay, but they also kind of feel like rewards as the player is working towards unlocking them. So we kind of knew how these stories would fit into the core loop of the game, but we didn't really know how long they would be or what they would be about. And we were wondering how kind of writing these types of stories for mobile would differ from console or computer games. And everything I had seen and heard was that players hate reading in mobile games, and they only play mobile games in moments of boredom or passing the time, like on a bus or a waiting room or something. But I was like, that can't be true. So I started where anyone would and researched what other narrative games looked like on the mobile market around this time, which was 2018. I looked at heaps of different games, but I'll just talk briefly about a couple that stood out. These were Tabiki Eru or Travel Frog, Animal Crossing, Pocket Camp, and Good Pizza, Great Pizza, which were inspiration for different parts of it. So for Travel Frog, we took inspiration from this game in its simple storytelling and slow relationship building. With very simple interactions, you care for this tiny frog and you just want to interact more and more in this world. The home base, which is the screenshot here, creates this kind of safe and familiar place for the player, but at the same time the game presents that there's this vast universe and world outside of the home. So that makes the game feel more interesting and larger, even though the mechanics are really simple and the scope is fairly small. And Animal Crossing was similar, but I looked more at the characters' personalities in the game to see how we can make people fall in love with these old dogs. In Animal Crossing, the characters with like the weirdest personalities and most unique looks are my favourites, and I feel like that's the quirk with old dogs as well. They're super unique looking, but that doesn't mean that they don't make great friends like puppies do as well. And this was also a central pillar of our design, to show the players what great friends old dogs can be. We wanted to have the ability to make the dogs sassy and show their personalities through how they change in their own story arcs as well as animations. And for Good Pizza, Great Pizza, they have, this game's actually also on computer as well, but I played it mostly on mobile. But they have really good reference for sort of like short, snappy, multiple choice dialogues. And this was really good inspiration for storytelling through character interactions and dialogues. And they also had a really playful but sincere tone, which I wanted to capture in Old Friends as well. And story games, of course, were a huge inspiration for us. So Choices and Episode were ones that I played for a while, and Emma was also really into Mystic Messenger, which gave a great understanding of how we could present how the story would actually look in the game and play. They're mostly kind of like short dialogues, all written with really kind of limited animations and movements. And all of these games really provided a lot of insight on how I wanted the game to feel, but ideally I wanted like lots of different individual parts of these games to be smushed together for Old Friends. So we wanted to try to balance this story and gameplay. We wanted the player to work towards the stories and have the gameplay and the stories be as fun as each other. So the first problem we had to solve was how to make the story within the game as engaging as the gameplay. So I did more research, and I came to understand that for mobile, players will rather replay a really good story rather than kind of explore different branches with this. And the information that I got for this was mostly from GDC talks, which I just listed there, as well as this book, Narrative Tactics for Mobile and Social Games, which actually came out in 2018, or 2019, I think, so it was really good timing. And so from these takeaways, from these talks, these were kind of the key points that I took from them. So having choice will improve retention in your game, and it also makes the game more fun and it makes players happier. However, players are 5 times more likely to replay a good story rather than try out different branching paths and narratives. So we decided we would give players the joy of choice, personalising responses and choosing outcomes rather than punishing them or creating like 5 different endings. The story beats also must be brief but significant, and brief does not mean simple. So the dog characters would really have to shine to keep the players interested. We also had to design a straightforward way for players to actually review the narrative. This would be what we call the Wolf Book, which we'll discuss later on. Therefore, our stories would all have to be short, simple, but still feel unique from each other to give players the joy of choice without having any major impact on the ending. So after all of this research and figuring out how we were going to present the stories, this tiny team formed. Programmer Jim, who is now actually Sam, Carla, who is an artist and writer, who's the one with the artist hat, and me as narrative designer, and I have the star on my head because I am the leader. And so Jim was in charge of implementing Yarn Spinner as our chosen tool, which Bridget will talk more in depth about later, but this was actually the first option we thought of, and we stuck from it from the beginning. And why was that? Well, it was because I had just played Night in the Woods, one of my favourite games of all time, and I knew that they had made it with Unity. That's exactly what we were doing, and I knew that they were using Yarn. So I figured, why not? It also looked a lot nicer to use than spreadsheets. I really don't like spreadsheets, and I just like look at them and cry, but I think it's because I don't really know how to use them properly. I also knew about ink and had used Twine for fun, but we stuck with Yarn because it worked for the stories that we had planned at this early time. I found it super easy to navigate as well as someone who had no knowledge of programming at all. And the functionality felt easy to create. I would just pitch the idea to Jim, who would just create it, and this was stuff like zooms and panning, just putting in different backgrounds, different animations. So it kind of made me feel more like a cinematographer, and that anything was accessible as well. So we had the tech up and running. I then pitched the suggested tone for the stories and had to do research for the cast of dogs. So how are we going to decide what kinds of characters these dogs would be and the actual stories that we wanted to tell? Since we already had the real life sanctuary to draw from, these characteristics were already established by Old Friends Senior Dog Sanctuary, plus we had our key design pillar showing the player what great friends old dogs can be. And I felt really lucky to have this like lore book to draw from. A big one was their social media posts. They're kind of like tiny narratives in themselves, and helped a lot with writing the stories and deciding what personalities the dogs would have. It would be really difficult to stray from these as well, because these dogs are like celebrities. This is just a fan blog that's still active today that's called the Tigger Appreciation Blog, and they just post every day with the same photo saying appreciate him. I also was already a huge fan, so I felt like I knew the dogs pretty well as well. Emma and I actually got to go and visit the real life sanctuary in 2018 as well, where lots of important field work was done, like petting the dogs and talking to the dogs and cuddling the dogs. But sadly I actually got food poisoning when I was there, so I could only be there for a few days, but that's another story. So we had decided on a cast of just 10 dogs that the player could adopt, with long stories that the player would work towards completing. And the main reason was, like I mentioned, we didn't want it to feel like a collection simulator. We wanted the players to feel close to the small cast of dogs that they met. And deciding this cast was probably the hardest decision we had to make, because all of the dogs are amazing and they have like over 100. But after hearing stories from the real life sanctuary workers, as well as meeting the dogs and kind of looking at who the big favourites were on social media, we managed to do it. So this is the final cast of dogs. We wanted them all to be different sizes, different looks, different personalities, as well as being recognisable to fans of old friends. So GDC talk that I mentioned, or that I showed on the slide just before, called Getting Players to Care Using Narrative to Drive Retention, gave crucial advice for kind of building these personalities as well. They said that for mobile, starting broad with positive and recognisable stereotypes and then building them out over time, as well as having good game writing that is not self-indulgent, write for your players, see who your players are for, which I was like, I'm the player, so this feels kind of easy. But to hook players into the story, we had to ensure that all of these dogs felt distinctly unique from each other. So just to talk about some of the dogs who are on the screen, Captain Ron, who's this like cowboy in the middle, he has like a really demanding attitude and he's like really picky, but he also canonically ran for dog vice president with running mate Mildred, who's this one-eyed pug. So, you know, he's got lots of range. And Babs is the one who's sniffing on the ground. She is a hard-working detective who can sniff out anything, and she's always on the hunt for what exactly, no one is sure. Sharky is the little sausage dog in the hot dog outfit, and he is really naughty and commanding. When we visited the real-life sanctuary, he actually was in the big dog area, despite being one of the smallest in the sanctuary, but it's because he is really naughty and likes to like bite toes and like kind of like bully the other dogs, but he's actually a big softie to those that he likes, including dogs and humans. And Kirby is the one who's like jumping. She is a senior dog but has the energy of a puppy. She demands to play fetch as often as she can and can also understand hand signals because she's deaf. So that's just kind of an example of the types of characters that we had. So with all this research done on how we were going to write the stories as well as who the characters would be, it was now time to actually write the stories. So originally they were actually going to be pretty static. This is an example of an old one from like, a year and a half ago, I want to say. So they were about 5 to 10 frames long, and we were going to have 5 of these. Yes. We were going to have 5 of these with 5 chapters overall. So that's 25 stories per dog, which would make 250 stories altogether. And the way that the overarching narrative across the game would work is that it starts out a bit simpler and tamer with these kind of quirky moments focused on simple, grounded moments that you share with the individual dogs. But kind of realised that early on it was going to be a real struggle to keep the stories fun and exciting because there's only so much you can do with a dog. And I didn't want to have each dog having the same sort of interactions and stories. So Carla took the research that I had done with the dogs and built on their personalities to create more of a story arc and narrative. An example of this is Bagel, who in real life was a neighbourhood dog who was just homeless and would just hang out in the same neighbourhood. And he got passed on to the real life old friends after being found in a drain after a huge storm. And so Carla created a story around Bagel being given to the player after a storm and having his arc focus on making him comfortable in his new home. And she also added in a neighbourhood with NPCs for the player to talk with, who all knew Bagel before he was adopted. So between the two of us, we had figured out a really good balance, as I felt pretty confident making the kind of smaller slice of life moment stories, and Carla enjoyed writing the overall plot with sort of suggested story beats. So once she was done with the beats of the story, I would take them and expand on them, fleshing out the entire story and the world building behind it. So this is just an example of some old storyboards and new ones. So you can see that the ones on the left are actually for just one chapter, which is 5 different stories. But the one on the right, however, an updated one, is just one story. So these got bigger and more complex as we kind of got more confident in our abilities, as we added animated dogs, NPCs, different sprites from trees to bushes and squirrels and chickens and lots of movement as well. So while we had found a good writing balance between the both of us, our ambitions got bigger, and therefore scope got bigger. I was the only one at the time implementing these into Yarn, and was also working part-time with community management as well. So we sort of realised early on that we didn't have the time and resource to sustainably keep up with ourselves. Lots of these things were also taking a while to figure out, since it was all new to us, and writing, implementing into Yarn, and then testing for what would become hundreds of stories. Just having one person doing it just wasn't going to work. How were we possibly going to show players what great friends old dogs can be if we couldn't go into as much depth as possible getting to know them? So a few things changed. I became lead narrative designer full-time. That's me. And we also hired the amazing Aditya to be community manager full-time. And we also expanded the team. So Bridget joined in 2019. Why Bridget? Bridget was also a huge fan of the real-life Old Friends Senior Dog Sanctuary, familiar with the content, tone and style with the game, also very knowledgeable in pet sims, and had wrapped up most of her work for Runaway's previous game, Bird B&B, that had everything ready for it. She's also my homie, very funny, perfect fit for the team. So with Bridget on the team and me being full-time, we needed to figure out a more solid pipeline for the story implementation, which came to be after we essentially stretched Yarn to its limits. And I'm going to hand over now to Bridget to go more in depth about this.
Hello. Also, we may have time for a quick Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, hold on to them, or there's an app, I
Put
think.
them in the app.
Yeah.
Sorry, I forgot.
Anyway, Lisa gets a break now to drink some water and stuff. So, one of my first tasks when I joined was to develop an updated vertical slice for the stories. So for us, this meant going hard with the most polish we would want out of a single story. And I unexpectedly used one of the longest and most action-heavy stories, where Mac explores the backyard and meets some of the local wildlife. It was a good stress test in retrospect, but it was a bit agonizing because we were ironing out like a ton of bugs in the process. And as Lisa mentioned, Yarn Spinner is the tool we use to create our interactive stories. So I wanted to give a brief look into it for people who are unfamiliar with it, and just also show how we specifically use it for old friends. So what is Yarn Spinner? It's a free and open source program that is used for interactive branching narratives. And it works with Unity, which we use. It uses a simple scripting language which programmers can make custom commands for. And this is sort of what the editor looks like. You can make little nodes which connect to each other in order to create a branching narrative. And then here's an example of one of our Yam Files. This is one of the dog chapters, so each dog has 5 chapters. And there are multiple stories within the chapter, and in this case, there's 3 of them. And some are very simple and linear, and then some of them are a bit more nuts. So I'll just have a brief, detailed breakdown of one of the individual nodes from a story in Old Friends. Enhance! So, got an image of what's happening and the code behind it. So, for setup, we got some audio for the background music, or ambience and foley. We set the background image. We can change the sort of camera zoom, so it's slightly zoomed in this case. And then there's a whole bunch here for setting up the dog, Sharky, such as size, position, animation, layer. And we have the crate here is like a spine file, so we have similar stuff to set up the position and size. And like the order, so we put it in front of Sharky so he kind of looks like he's coming out. And that's kind of all the setup. And then the text appears, and the player just needs to tap the screen to continue. Crate opens, Sharky kind of changes his animation to stand up, and he just waits a little moment for a second, and then he'll walk forward, and then the camera pans as he's doing that. And then at the end, we just finally have the next bit of dialogue and the buttons which will go on to the next node. So our programmers make us a bunch of codes to do the stuff we want, and we call them as these pink commands here in the Yarn editor. And the way Yarn works is like a plugin. With the help of our cool programmers, we can have a lot of flexibility though. We can ask them to create sort of very simple shorthand commands, or have them be a bit more complex to give the writers more control. So we generally try and strike a balance between the two. For example, a super simple way of making a command could be like, Sharky, walk to the center of the screen in X number of seconds, and a more complicated command, which is more like what we have now, is Sharky, play the walk forward animation and move to these specific coordinates and take X number of seconds to get there, but then wait until you've reached the destination and then play your standing animation. So that's kind of a quick rundown of just the technical side of how we make the stories. Also, if you want to know more about the tech side of Yarn, our awesome programmer Sam is here and happy to answer those kinds of questions. But we don't just make storyboards and turn them into code like some programming wizard gods. Almost, but not quite. There's a few more steps involved. So this is just a rundown of our full pipeline for making a dog story. Each dog in the game has their own story arc, with 5 chapters and a total of about 22 individual stories. Lisa.
Lisa. So as I mentioned earlier, research on who the dogs are and what their real life story comes first. We would find as many videos and photos as we could work with, as well as collaborating with artists to create custom animations, accessories, and furniture that would feature in their stories. And we would of course use the real life sanctuary as our anchor for this. And once the research was ready, Carla would storyboard the main arc and beats, and what we used was Adobe XD. There is no limit on this as well, so she would do as many or as little that she felt were needed for the main story arc. And we use Adobe XD because it's simple and fast to just quickly copy and move around images in each frame. They're pretty crude, but XD and other prototyping tools also make it super easy to create interactive versions, but we didn't really need this step since we just kind of read them in this sequential comic-like format. Dragging in and out assets as we needed.
So next we have an internal meeting to just read over and give feedback on the storyboards and just brainstorm ideas for the rest of the Yarn stories. And then after this, we usually start putting together the story outline document. So we figure out how to space out these story beats and write quick synopsises for the other stories we want to have. We also add some other information, just like where we're going to put rewards and blog post unlocks.
And then after that, we would add in our little character focus moments or slice of life moments and flesh them out in the full storyboard. So yeah, around 20 to 25 stories in total per dog.
Next, it's time for more feedback with the story team. Once again, we present the whole story and look for things that feel uncharacteristics, any plot holes, or maybe just funny moments that we think of to add in. And lots of woofs are very important. We read them aloud. After this, we would just make any edits suggested in the meeting and implement the text into Yarn. So this is mostly just copy and pasting, and it'll take around a day or two.
And then once this was ready, I would give the storyboards to Zoe, who's our managing director at Runaway. It sounds kind of random, but she also has like TV experience with storytelling and stuff, so it was really good to get outside eyes around this early stage just to make sure that the story felt fun and engaging and showed the character of the dog and that it made sense. So after she would do this, I would just implement the changes needed from this feedback, which was normally pretty small, just things like tone, things that felt missing.
After this, it's all go, baby. We make the story come alive. We make what we call playable Yarn stories, and these have all the basic visual elements like backgrounds, dogs, NPCs, just necessary camera movement and animations, but just none of the polish.
And once the story is playable, it's time to add in localization IDs so that all of the text can be easily translated in a spreadsheet. But I am not going to talk about localization and translation in this talk because it's huge. But there's a localization talk straight after this one. Can't wait to find out about this stuff. Love localization. But there's also another talk about dialogue after this, which also looks great. It's too hard to make decisions. But after this, once the story is playable, we pass it on to Jonas, who is our grammar and spelling expert, and Aditya, our community manager, who has a good understanding of the game community. We wanted to do this to get fresh eyes, grammar checks, and sensitivity reading, and this is arguably the most important part because, as you can see, Jonas left some feedback because he didn't know what a suspicious-looking booty would be. But I left this in because I knew that our players, who had an understanding of the tone of Old Friends, would know exactly what I meant. However, I did remove the word arouse because who knows how that could have been taken.
Alright, so then we just work on the yarn polish stage where we go in and add more detail, like switching animations of dogs and poses, expressions of NPCs, more fancy camera movement, zooming and panning and all that, special effects like sparkles, and all just making sure the dogs look like the right size relative to their surroundings. And then just when that's all done, I'll go through and all the stories one more time, just checking for extra polish or weird bugs that we may have missed. And then the audio, Dylan adds some swaggy beats, woofs, knocks, all that good stuff in yarn, a cool audio music dude. And then we do this last because it's just easier to manage and audio can just be timed correctly to the animations and events that are happening in yarns.
And then finally, QA has the horror of testing our wacky monstrosities. So we do as much testing as we can when implementing the stories, but you will always, no matter what, miss something. And QA is the most valuable part of creating a game like this. I'm so thankful that we actually have an internal team of 3 people at Runaway, as well as external testers to inform us of any horrific mistakes that we've created. And that's it. Whew.
So, despite the fact that most of this work is done by us 3 and plus our programmer when we need some new command or I managed to break something, we have a much wider circle of people who contribute. So the artists, they create art assets for us to use, some of the stuff we grab from other parts of the game, which is great, but they also make us custom story art like backgrounds, specific animations, certain props. And then on the flip side, some of the story assets have also been used for other parts of the game, like the NPC characters, which is cool. And Lisa already mentioned our feedback team, as well as our translators, who often come in at a later stage. Forgot to add them. Oh no, I did. And audio and QA. Not to mention all the others from the Old Friends team who help us out in numerous ways. So, while it seems like a huge group, in reality hardly any of us are actually working on the stories full time. Even me and Lisa, who mainly work on our stories, still do other bits of work as well, and we're usually also working on multiple dog stories or other tasks at once. And I have a tiny artist hat for when I do a tiny bit of art. But wait, there's more. We aren't just writers. We are narrative designers, baby. Connecting the story world with the game world is super important, so we'll just go through some examples of this and what we did. So while our main story team's tasks are about creating these stories, it's important that we make the whole game world feel connected, the experience. Choices in the story are a way that can lead to different paths and outcomes, and there's a handful of rewards for each dog as the player makes progress, and often they'll differ depending on player choices. Sometimes the choice is made obvious, and other times it's more of a surprise. Some of the ways we reward players are dog blog posts. So these are like journal entries, and whenever paths change, we try to make different posts the player will unlock. Some of these can be bonuses if players do specific things, and they can be shared on social media as well, so players can see if others get different text posts. Costumes and furniture. These are one of the most exciting rewards for players to receive. We try to make these tie into parts of the story instead of just being arbitrary rewards that players will receive when they complete the segment. For example, Chanel needs her own bed. You can choose either to try and buy one online or try your hand at DIYing one yourself. For the costumes, usually the player receives a slight variant. They're often even directly asked which colour they want. Because it's so exciting, we decided it's super important and deserves a grand reveal. So every time you get a new dog costume, it will enter a brief magical girl transformation sequence. Oh, is this the video? No, it's a GIF.
No, there's no audio, but imagine it's like...
It's important to note here that this was an MVP feature and the game could not ship without this. Moving on. Every dog has a favorite type of toy and food they like to eat. This impacts the gameplay of taking care of your dogs. We write narratives around how you find out what they like, and occasionally other information about them, like discovering their breed. Quests are a kind of more gamey sort of thing, but we're able to unlock those after stories, and they can be a fun way to continue them. They come in the form of direct messages from fans or characters you meet in the stories. They're a fun and not too time-intensive way to add more narrative to the rest of the game. For example, Evan sends you this message after you help him move house in the last yarn, thanking you and Babs. We also have non-scripted quests, which we created to feel like they are messages from fans. In the collab of the century between the story team, gameplay programmers, and helpful insights from community managers and the support team, we made the quest system. So the way it works is 3 parts of text are randomly combined, but they have tags for like different personalities, if they use a formal or informal kind of writing style, and the task-specific dialogue like baking, for instance. It's still limited by how many different sentences we add, but we can make characters feel like they have distinctive personalities from one another, and it was fun to make. Hey bestie, I love the cute muddy paw prints Mac leaves everywhere, but it would be a good time to clean them up. Thanks, night. Bo howdy, I heart your live streams. When will the next one be? Would you do it if I gave you a reward? Oh, I just can't wait. Thank you. You better show me your dog skills or I won't be donating. Huh, Cool Angel's Rest Home looks overgrown. Have you heard of gardening? The most important part of gardening is to pull out all the weeds. Do it. I've been a professional gardener for 30 years and I know every plant name. You better do it. And then at the very start of the game, the player gets to create a sanctuary name. Through coding magic, we can reference this in the story, and it's usually hilarious. I spilled hot tea all over my pants. I'm not hurt, but what is going on at Cool Angel's Rest Home? You'll have to play the game to find out. So, Joshua is a fictional character. During the events of the narrative, he overcomes challenges such as his fear of dogs. We too face challenges, like most other fictional characters and models. So let's talk about those. So was yarn the right thing to use? The simple answer, yeah, it's efficient, but it does have its downsides too, and the way we use it. Yarn has its share of annoying bugs. The editor could be a bit more polished. We worked around that stuff. But also, yarn wasn't really designed to be a complete cinematography tool or cutscene maker. It can be, but we probably could have relied on it a bit less for visual aspects and used custom tools or Unity timeline in tandem. I'm just going to skip over this one because I think we're going a bit late. Basically, we made a bunch of optimizations, had this really annoying debug menu. It was bad. Now we have a cool editor for where we can quickly play through yarns. Should we do this bit, or do we have...
Yeah, we could.
Okay.
What about keeping stories fresh? we had a cast of 10 dogs and around 200 stories, so we didn't want to make them feel repetitive. To manage this workload, we did less overall stories for some of the later on dogs, but some of the stories are quite long by comparison, so we generally do try to cut them down. It's harder than making things longer and try to focus on more interesting branches than long linear ones. The first 3 dogs in particular have pretty normal plot lines that you'd expect about dogs, caring for them and making them comfortable in a new home. But further on, we tried to find ways that the dogs can participate in different kinds of plots, such as a detective mystery story, which we made up entirely, but is inspired by Babs's love of sniffing and searching. Or Mildred's election campaign to become president of the sanctuary, based on real-life fundraisers from the real-life sanctuary. I mentioned the NPCs earlier, which we didn't actually anticipate would be a big part of the story outside of Bagel's narrative, but we found having this cast greatly helped to expand the world building and involving their interactions and relationships with the dogs. One example is Joshua, who starts at the beginning as a grumpy neighbour who's actually afraid of dogs and generally a pretty nervous person. But after meeting Mac, he grows to see that dogs can make great friends and ends up becoming very close with the player later on. And he also has a brother, Noah, who became the resident hottie. He works at the animal shelter, and internal feedback saw that people, Zoe, wanted to flirt with him. And while this isn't a dating sim at all, we decided to add in some more kind of like flirty dialogues if the player chooses to pick them. And we also had a lot of fun making dream sequence stories where all sorts of absurd situations can play out in the main character's psyche. As the player continues their journey of a single person living with tons of dogs all day, dreams and reality may start to blur. For example, we decided that Kirby would go to the moon. It's because she jumps really high, and so she jumps all the way to the moon.
How are we doing time?
Yeah, we good.
Oh, okay, cool. And finally, we come to the Old Friends dog game cinematic universe timeline. So rather than one continuous linear path, stories are tied to their specific dog, unlocking as you gain loyalty, which is experience from them in the game. You start with one dog, Mac, and then after completing the first chapter, you unlock the next dog, and so on and so forth. However, as I mentioned, the stories get unlocked per dog, so the player will unlock stories for multiple dogs as they're going. And the amount of loyalty required to unlock the next story also goes up, and it varies from dog to dog. So there's kind of a weird-looking sequence in this image of what you'd actually unlock. So essentially this can make the timeline of events kind of complicated. Although this dog's story arcs are fairly self-contained, there's still a bit of crossover of other dogs and NPCs. So we try and have a few rules and safeguard things from getting messy. If there's potential conflicts we notice, we try and give them a wide berth. If a character gets introduced and then reappears later, we want to make sure the player has met them first. One problematic situation was when Doris was going to go on an extended vacation, but she would have appeared in another dog story during this time, so we revised it. As for the dogs, in terms of the unlock order, future dogs just don't appear in previous dog stories, so you won't see Babs appear in any of Mac's stories, for example. There's a few kind of small exceptions to this, because actually we can sort of have, like, if you've passed Part 5, Chapter 1, the next dog we know will be in there, but the reason we don't do this for most of them is because we're adding sort of dog stories as we went in open beta, so they may not be out yet, and it was just like a lot. And we have a few other small tricks and like checks we can do to see what the player progress is, but we just don't do them much because the stories are already pretty long and it's just chasing down edge cases, which isn't a great use of our time. And some other things we kind of tried earlier on was like roadblocks, but we just scrapped it because it was just not very nice UX. No one liked it. And so although we kind of worked around our whole timeline issues in the end, it's just an experience that we want to try and avoid in future games. So those were some of the bigger points, but we'll just do a quick fire summary of what went right and wrong. So we had a dedicated story team. We had good pipeline, including other parts of the team, such as art. We stuck through yarn throughout, and it's a pretty efficient and easy way to write stories. Custom quest tool was good. The tone stayed consistent between like the fictional and non-fictional kind of elements of the story. And the yarn system, in terms of the tech side, took about 8 months of ongoing front-end work for one developer who wasn't full-time, so it was pretty good, I hear. And we are mobile narrative gods now. But we still had some things that could be better and weren't the best. The story team could have been just established earlier. Design took longer than planned for. Elaborate story system could have been prototyped earlier and more extensively. We could have just aimed higher earlier. A narrative design mentor at the start of the project would have been helpful. And just relying less on yarn for visual aspects and more on like Unity timeline or custom tools. Complicated narrative structure because of the separate timelines. And just maybe potential tone whiplash between story and game. Take caution. Kirby Too Fast, Too Furious. Kirby was the most painful dog because she loves to run around all over the place, unlike the rest of the elderly dogs. Sorry, Kirby. It just a bit agonizing. So, just to close things, a lot of the above points are from our post-mortem doc, and we'd highly recommend making one of these. If you're part of a big team like us, of like 10 or more people, maybe making one specifically for your department, like art, programming, and that kind of thing. Or just if you have a smaller team, you could maybe do one. So we did this before the game was actually finished, but we already had the pipeline pretty sussed. Part of it was because Jim left, so we were like, we need to know your knowledge before you go. And it didn't take much time. So I kind of made some starting prompts for what went right, wrong, could be improved, and we just discussed these in a meeting. And we also kind of speculated a little on how we may approach future games with narrative aspects.
So let's wrap up this entire package with some final takeaways. At the beginning, do as much research as possible before you start writing. Also, start big and then shave things down, not the other way around like we did. If you find a tool that works, don't waste time looking for alternatives, especially if it works for people like me who are not familiar with programming. Always plan, and add custom tools that fit as well. Always plan the gameplay alongside the narrative so they feel naturally at one with each other. And look for opportunities to incorporate the narrative everywhere that you can. Get weird early. Even if there isn't anything already existing in the space you're working on, that's probably a good thing. You're doing something new and building on existing successes. And at the start, I sort of talked about that thing about how mobile players don't like reading, but people actually love to read. When I did a search of the word story in all of our reviews from beta, the stories get talked about positively consistently. I couldn't find any bad ones, and that feels so good. So please don't be afraid for actually writing heaps of dialogue and big long stories, because people seem to love it. Thank you so much for listening to our talk. Runaway is also hiring, so please talk to us. I can't remember the roles, but programmer is one of them.
Business cards.
I don't have any.
I do.
Talk to Bridget for business cards.
I only have 6, I think.
And the game is also coming out next week. Yeah! Thank you. You can actually play it in limited launch right now in New Zealand, but you should just wait for the good thing next week.
Big launch.
Yeah, big launch. That was cool. I didn't know we had that. And also Runaway is doing some other talks at NZGDC as well. So Seth is later on this afternoon if you want to hear more about live ops for mobile. If you want to hear me talking some more, I'm going to be on an awesome panel with a bunch of other New Zealand devs about designing non-violent games. And Zoe is also on a panel about building studios, not games. Go to them. They're good. And we have 1 minute for question, and I read the question, and it was who is our favourite dog, and I wasn't sure if that was like real life sanctuary or game. So for the real life sanctuary, Tinker is my favourite, and she's a 3-legged like fox kind of terrier who I got to meet at the real life sanctuary, and we like bonded, and I wish I could have adopted her, but she lives in America, so but she's still thriving. And in the game, my favourite dog is probably Sharky, because I did basically all of his story, and he's just a little bastard. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to choose like a favourite of the real ones. Maybe Tyler, just because he's cute, and I don't know. I don't have a photo, but look him up. And yeah, I also like Sharky, the sausage dog. He's good.
Thank you.